Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Yorona Anon, Director of the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies Program and Associate Professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of Charleston. I'd like to welcome you to another very exciting event, a conversation with Dr. and Rabbi David Dalin on the life and legacy of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, tonight in a partnership between Synagogue Emmanuel and the Jewish Studies Program. This event is also one of a long series that our program is hosting this semester, all of which are virtual and free. Our next event, just a couple seconds to mention those, we'll have a next event that will take place on Tuesday, the 30th of this month at 7 p.m. It'll be the third and final installment of my conversation with former member of the Knesset, Nachman Shai, who may be again a member of the Knesset, depending on the results of the election next week. On Thursday, April 1st at 7 p.m., we will host the annual Kronsberg Lecture featuring Professor Christine Hayes of Yale University. And on Monday, April 5th, also at 7 p.m., Synagogue Emmanuel will be hosting an event titled Step Up South Carolina, a forum to stamp out hate. Information about these and many other upcoming events will appear in the chat shortly. And you can also find this information and links to register via Zoom on our website at jewish.cfc.edu/events and on our Facebook page. And I also believe information about the Synagogue Emmanuel's programs is found on their website. And anyway, you will find all the relevant links to all the events you need in the chat shortly. I shall now turn this over to tonight's moderator, who will also introduce our speaker. Ellen Steinberg has been the West Ashley Magistrate since 2013. She started her career as a public defender representing juveniles and then an assistant solicitor prosecuting domestic violence cases. She's licensed to practice law in Texas and South Carolina, and she's also a major fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and is thrilled to moderate the program tonight. Ellen, please.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Yes, I'm very thrilled. I have my Ruth Bader Ginsburg doll with me, so we're in good shape. It is really my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. David Dalin. He's a senior research fellow at Brandeis University, an ordained rabbi, and a widely published scholar of American Jewish history. He is also the author or co-author of 12 books. His most recent book that we're going to discuss this evening is Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, From Brandeis to Kagan, which is published by the Brandeis University. This nationally acclaimed book was selected as a finalist for the Jewish Book Council's 2017 National Jewish Book Award. Now, in all fairness, Dr. Dalin only wanted me to tell you that, but there's a lot more to him, so I'm going to let you know more. This book is also the very first history of the 8 Jewish men and women who have served or currently serve on the United States Supreme Court. Dr. Dalin has been a visiting professor at George Washington University and at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and has been a Taub Research Fellow in American History at Stanford University. He's been an adjunct scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Academic Council of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies. He now serves also as an academic advisor and editorial for the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives, and as a member of the Board of Directors at the Palm Beach County region of the American Jewish Committee. Dr. Dalin received his BA from the University of California at Berkeley. He received his MA and PhD from Brandeis University and also received his rabbinic ordination and a second MA from the Jewish Theological Seminary. In 2015, he was awarded the Honorary Doctorate of Divinity from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And now it is my pleasure to start, and let's learn what we can about Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Dr. Dalin.
Yes.
Let's begin. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where she comes from?
Okay, well, she was born in 1933, and she grew up in a working class part of Brooklyn's Flatbush neighborhood. Both of her parents were impoverished immigrants, her mother from Austria and her father from Russia. Now, she went to a very well-known high school in Brooklyn, James Madison High School. And amongst the other graduates of James Madison High School have been 3 United States senators, Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders, and Norm Coleman, the singer-songwriter Carole King, the actor Martin Landau, and no less than 4 Nobel Prize winners. Now, sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
Okay, she was an outstanding student at James Madison High School. She edited the school newspaper and wrote articles about the school's history and the U.S. judicial system. In fact, her interest in the law was already apparent, as demonstrated in an editorial, Landmarks of Constitutional Freedom, in which she discussed the meaning of the 10 Commandments, the British England's Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the UN Charter. She was also an officer of the Go-Getters, a pep club for sporting and social events. She played cello in the school orchestra and twirled a baton at football games. During the summers, she worked as a camp counselor at a Jewish summer camp in the Adirondacks. In 1948, at the age of 15, she served as the camp rabbi, delivering sermons to fellow campers.
So it's obvious she distinguished herself early on as quite an overachiever.
She did indeed. She did indeed.
So where'd she go to college?
She went to Cornell University. And there was a tragedy here. The day before her high school graduation, she was such a top student that she got in very easily. She got into several colleges, but her mother died the day before her high school graduation. She had been suffering from cancer. So it was kind of a mixed, thing leaving Brooklyn to go to Cornell. But she distinguished herself at Cornell also. She majored in government. She made Phi Beta Kappa. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa. And she met her husband, her future husband, Martin Ginsburg. And they would have an idyllic marriage of 56 years before he died in 2010.
We often hear people talk about that special relationship that Justice Ginsburg had with her husband. I understand that he was a little bit older than she. So did they both graduate Cornell at the same time?
No, he was a year older. So he graduated a year before. And then they graduated from law school, both at Harvard. Well, there's an interesting technicality here. He graduated Harvard Law School the year before she did. So she left Harvard Law School to go to New York with him, where he got a job with one of the big tax firms. And he became had a very distinguished career as a tax lawyer in New York. He also was a lecturer at Columbia University Law School. But she gave up graduating at Harvard Law School, and she always felt bad about they didn't give her the permission to graduate from Harvard. She officially graduated from Columbia. But it's interesting, she made the law review. At Harvard, she was the first woman ever to make the Harvard Law Review. And then she made the law review again at Columbia in her last year. So she has a distinction of being one of the first people, men or women, to have graduated as members of 2 very prestigious law reviews.
Very prestigious, in fact.
Very prestigious.
So, people have often spoken about her years at Harvard. And when she went to law school at Harvard, I understand there were not very many women in the class. And what was her takeaway from that experience at Harvard?
Well, it was a difficult takeaway. She was one of 9 women in a class of over 500. And prior to the 1950s, the continuing issue of whether to admit women to Harvard Law School had divided the faculty and administration, for many years. Although the dean, Erwin Griswold, had announced the decision to admit women in October of 1949, thus opening a door previously closed to Jewish women in the legal profession, or to women generally. He was not especially welcoming to Ginsburg and her fellow women classmates. During his 21-year tenure as dean, women were accepted only as token members of their class. Moreover, they were not permitted to live in the law school dormitories or to study in one of the Lamont Library's, the law school's study rooms. At a dinner hosted, I think I may have told you about this, Ellen, when we spoke, at a dinner hosted for the women students at his home, Dean Griswold, who, like most of the other faculty colleagues his during the 1950s, publicly questioned whether women should have the right to enter the legal profession. And he asked each woman who was over for dinner how she could justify taking places that would otherwise have gone to qualified male students. And that obviously put the women in a very awkward position. And this was supposedly at an informal dinner at his own home. Despite such obstacles, Ginsburg excelled, making history by becoming the first female member of the Law Review. But it's interesting, years later when she became famous, first as a federal judge and then as a justice of the Supreme Court, Harvard wanted to always invite her back to give her her graduation degree that she never had. And she never would accept that. She said, if I wasn't good enough for you when I was a student, then I'm declining your offer now.
Just one more reason we have so much respect for her.
Right.
So, we also hear, so here comes Justice Ginsburg. She finishes 2 years at Harvard. She's on law review. She goes to Columbia. She's at Columbia. She's in law review, graduates at the top of her class.
Once again, yeah.
Everybody must want her, right?
Right.
Everybody wants to hire her.
Well, not really. And that's the thing. That's the sad, thing. She couldn't get a job when she graduated Harvard Law School. Ironically, she was recommended when she graduated Columbia, but she was recommended for a Supreme Court clerkship by a professor, Albert Sachs at Harvard Law School. And he recommended her to Justice Felix Frankfurter, the Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. Frankfurter wouldn't even meet with her to discuss it. He
wouldn't meet with her?
He wouldn't meet with her even to interview her. And when asked about it, he said, he was already getting somewhat elderly, that he was set in his ways. He was not ready yet to have a woman as a law clerk. He had never had a woman as a research assistant at Harvard. And what makes this so ironic is Frankfurter, when he also in his day graduated at the top of his class with glowing recommendations from law professors, he couldn't get a job in a big city law firm because he was Jewish, because of anti-Semitism.
Wow.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg lost out not because she was Jewish in this case, but because she was a woman. But I've always thought it's kind of ironic that Frankfurter could not reach out, given that he had the experience of having been discriminated against.
Right. So tell us, where was her first job?
Well, it's interesting. She got a job for 2 years as a law clerk with a federal judge in New York City. And she had that in Manhattan for 2 years. After that, she was hired as a research associate and then as the associate director of Columbia University's comparative law project. And she was given the assignment of studying Sweden's judicial system. Now, this is interesting. She didn't know a word of Swedish, but the work, which was funded by the Carnegie Foundation, allowed her to learn Swedish, visit Sweden on several occasions to observe the country's courts, and to co-author with a Swedish judge Civil Procedure in Sweden, a major text for which she was later awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Lund in Sweden. It also it furthered her growing interest in an academic career in teaching, in the possibility of teaching law.
So did she go on to teach after this?
Yes, she did. She started at Rutgers University Law School, and there, and she was there for 9 years actually in the 1960s. And there she faced another kind of discrimination. She was pregnant with what became her second child, but she was afraid that all of her colleagues and the dean were all male, that they wouldn't smile favorably upon her having another baby while she was teaching at the law school. So she borrowed loose-fitting clothes that she got from her mother-in-law and wore them so that she wouldn't be targeted for discrimination. But oh, sorry.
No, I'm commenting. So at what point did she get involved with the ACLU?
Well, that was at the end of her being at Rutgers Law School and before she started teaching at Columbia Law School in 1971. She incidentally became the first woman tenured professor at Columbia Law School. And a piece of trivia, her daughter teaches there now, which is kind of interesting. She started for 8 years at Columbia Law School. She co-founded the ACLU's Women's Rights Project and began to teach courses on sex discrimination, in addition to her courses on civil procedure and constitutional law. In her 8 years at Columbia, during the 1970s, she taught courses on sex discrimination law and prepared the first legal textbook ever on gender-based discrimination. Also, throughout the 1970s, as attorney for the Women's Rights Project, she led a campaign to persuade the Supreme Court that gender discrimination, just like race discrimination, should be prohibited by the Constitution and its Equal Protections Clause. Inspired by the gradualist litigation strategy of Thurgood Marshall, who had famously led the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund's fight to end racial discrimination, she won several historic cases at the Supreme Court, 6 in total in the emerging field of sex discrimination law. And as the attorney, for the Women's Rights Project, she argued these 6 gender discrimination cases. In these cases, she sought to achieve for the first time, which she did, legal recognition of women's rights by persuading the court's members that any form of sex-based discrimination was unconstitutional. And she won in 5 of these cases, 5 of these 6 cases.
Absolutely groundbreaking work, truly.
And for anybody who's seen the movie On the Basis of Sex, I recommend it wholeheartedly. It's about her work. You know, there's a good argument to say, Ellen, that she would have been famous had she never been on the Supreme Court.
Because of her arguments and how she structured them.
Right.
Just brilliant. So you talk about how she went on to be on the court. Her first position obviously was not the United States Supreme Court.
No, she was appointed by Jimmy Carter to the federal court, the DC Court of Appeals in Washington, DC, which is the second most prominent federal court after the Supreme Court. She was appointed in 1980 and served on the Supreme Court until 1993. And in 1993, Bill Clinton appointed her to the Supreme Court. And it's interesting, he only had 2 Supreme Court appointments during his 8-year presidency, and each of them was a Jewish justice. The first was Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1993, and the second was Stephen Breyer in 1994, the following year. And President Clinton's first choice had been actually Mario Cuomo, who was then in his third term as governor of New York, but he declined, saying that he preferred to stay in New York as governor. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg became his next nominee, and he noted that she had won several landmark, in announcing his appointment, he noted she had won several landmark discrimination cases before the Supreme Court in the 1970s. And he called Ginsburg the Thurgood Marshall of gender discrimination law, who was to the women's movement what Thurgood Marshall was to the rights of African Americans.
But I'm going to interrupt you here, because you say that, but on the other hand, there were many of the women's rights activists who were against Ruth Bader Ginsburg being appointed to the Supreme Court. What was that about?
Well, that was because she had made some statements while on the federal bench before that about Roe v. Wade, about the abortion decision. And she had some qualms, not that she was very much completely pro-choice, but she had some qualms about how the case was decided. And in terms of the constitutional litigation that it was decided by. I talk about that in my book. And because of that, she wasn't 1,000%, for the decision, although she always was a strong advocate as a pro-choice advocate.
Thank you. We talk about the Supreme Court, and obviously in the last 4 years, we've become much more familiar with Supreme Court justices being appointed. But, I wanted to ask you if you could help us just with a little bit of history of the Supreme Court. When was it first organized, and how many justices sat on that Supreme Court?
Well, it was organized by George Washington, actually, during his first presidency in the 1790s. Excuse me. And there were originally only 5 justices on the court. And it changed over the years. In the 1860s, it went to what's now the status of 9 justices being on the court. And you may know, and some of you listening may know, that in the many Democrats now, since Ruth Bader Ginsburg's tragic death, and since the appointment of her successor by President Trump, there's been a move now to consider expanding, filling the court with more justices, to increase the number of justices on the court from 9 to even 15. And the reason for that is, although it still goes back and forth, and some Democrats are in favor of it and some are not, the Republicans, for the most part, are not, because this would be a way to have more Democrats be appointed to the court. The only person who ever tried to do that before was Franklin D. Roosevelt. He tried to pack the court in the 1930s. And what that meant was the conservative Republicans on the court were blocking in his liberal New Deal legislation. So he thought if he could pack the court with 6 more justices and appoint liberal Democrats, he would be able to save the court from the conservative Republicans. But it wasn't looked at very fondly by most court observers then, or for that matter now, really.
History tends to repeat itself sometimes.
It does. And there may be a movement in the next few months for this again.
We'll see.
In fact, there has been a movement now to try to convince Stephen Breyer, who's 82 years old but in good health, to retire from the court so that the experience of Ruth Bader Ginsburg won't be repeated. That, in other words, that Joe Biden would have an opportunity sooner rather than later, before the 2022 elections, while there's a Democratic Senate, to appoint another Democrat to the court. But Stephen Breyer,
No, which really leads to that next question, because, so many of us really just had enormous respect and true affection for Justice Ginsburg. But there was pressure that she retire while President Obama was still in office.
Yes, a great deal of pressure. And, you know, when in 2010, when the John Paul Stevens, who was 91 years old, by the way, at the time, when he retired, and he was a Republican, but a very liberal Republican, part of the court's liberal bloc, actually. And when he retired, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was then the next oldest justice, she was 77 or 78 then, and in very poor health, there was a lot of discussion that she should retire then, while there was a Democrat in the White House and while there was a Democratic Senate. But she absolutely refused. And the same thing happened when before Donald Trump was elected. There was a move to say, because also it was, you know, there was no guarantee, well, before 2012, that a Republican Mitt Romney would appoint a liberal to success her, to succeed her. In fact, there was not much likelihood of it. But she remained even a lot of her admirers have criticized her, sadly, I don't think it's very appropriate, but even after she died, saying that she should have, this was the big mistake of her legal career, that she should have retired before Donald Trump. Now, of course, she and everybody else assumed that Hillary Clinton would have been elected then. And I think my guess is that had Hillary Clinton been elected, she would have retired and she would have been succeeded by a liberal Democrat.
Did not happen.
No.
The other thing is there's been conversation I've heard about what they call a Jewish seat on the Supreme Court.
Oh, yes.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Of course. The Jewish seat was the first Jewish appointment to the Supreme Court was Louis Brandeis, after whom Brandeis University is named, incidentally. And it started a tradition after his appointment that when one Jewish justice retired or passed away, another Jew would be appointed in his or her stead. In that case, it was his stead. There was a comparable thing with the Catholic seat on the court, in which there was at one point a Catholic justice first who then retired, and he was appointed by another Catholic, and so on and so forth. But no, it became a tradition, so much so that the President of the United States would often consult Jewish leaders after the retirement of a Jewish justice, or would, as to who a good appointee would be to replace, to hold the vacancy for the Jewish seat. And this continued until the retirement of Abe Fortas in 1969. And this was not a very happy retirement. He had been accused of impropriety, of judicial impropriety, of accepting money from a foundation whose director, it was the Lewis Wolfson Foundation. When you're on the Supreme Court, you're not supposed to have other income. Fortas and his wife were partners in one of the big Washington, D.C. law firms. They had a joint income together in the 1950s of $300,000. And they both had a very high standard of living. She proverbially had 150 pairs of shoes in one closet alone. But they had twin Rolls Royces, and they lived very well. So when she was very against his taking the Supreme Court nomination. He was a close friend and advisor of Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson very much wanted to appoint him to the court. Can I tell the reason? Do I have a minute or two to tell the story?
It's fascinating, yes.
Because, with the Jewish seat, the Jewish justice in the 1960s was Arthur Goldberg. Now, Arthur Goldberg was one of the country's premier labor lawyers. And he was the head of he merged the AFL and the CIO. And when he was appointed first Secretary of Labor, and then when Felix Frankfurter retired in 1962, he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, he liked it, he enjoyed his time on the Supreme Court very well. But LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, pressured him to retire. And there was a reason for this. And people say that you could never turn down Lyndon Johnson when he pressured you. When Lyndon Johnson first ran for the Senate in 1948, he was a congressman, little known, from Texas. And he ran against an incumbent senator, and in an election in which there were 1,560,000 votes cast, he won the election supposedly by 87 votes. Jokingly, he was referred to afterwards as Landslide Lyndon, not very affectionately always. But it was such a close election that it went to the Supreme Court, and a blue ribbon committee of Washington lawyers argued on his behalf, and the person who did this was Abe Fortas. And Abe Fortas argued successfully, and Lyndon Johnson was elected to the Senate by 87 votes. Had he not been elected, we never would have heard of Lyndon Johnson. And as a result, he was always wanted to repay Abe Fortas. He was his private attorney, but he wanted to first to appoint him Attorney General, but Fortas would have had to take such a great salary cut, a 90% salary cut, to accept that, because he and his wife were making such major salaries. And the same with the Supreme Court appointment. So he made the mistake, because he and his wife couldn't live on the lesser income. He took a grant from this Lewis Wolfson, who was a Jewish foundation executive and businessman, and he was given an income of 90% of his Supreme Court salary to teach law at American University. But this was considered a thing of impropriety. As being on the Supreme Court, you were not supposed to do this. And what added insult to injury, Wolfson was then accused and convicted of corruption and sent to prison. And the fact that he was Abe Fortas's private attorney and good friend was not good for Fortas. So Fortas retired, and LBJ made the mistake then of trying to appoint Fortas as Chief Justice when Earl Warren retired. And that caused a big controversy because of the would-be scandal with Lewis Wolfson, which I incidentally talk about a great deal in my book. But it's sad, because he was they said he was the most brilliant law student ever to have an academic career at Yale Law School, before or since.
Wow.
But after him, there was no Jewish seat on the court for another 24 years, until Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed. And then there was not one Jewish seat, but 2 Jews. And then, of course, Elena Kagan was appointed as the 3rd Jew on the court in 2010.
You know, it's fascinating, because most of us really only think of Justice Ginsburg as the only Jewish person on the court.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
Well, she's better known. She's also become such an icon, a liberal icon, as you know, as we discussed, with she's the book
RBG.
RBG, the terrible RBG.
Right, RBG, yes.
Yeah, and she has more charisma than Steve Breyer, who I happen to know. He's from San Francisco, as I am, and I know his family. He does not have the same charisma he's a brilliant jurist also, and a brilliant legal scholar. And Elena Kagan, but she has a lot in common with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she hasn't been on the court for that long. In fact, one piece of trivia, they had the same workout, what do you call it?
Their trainer.
They had the same personal trainer who they would train with twice a week. And this, despite the fact that Elena Kagan was 28 years younger than Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh, she was an animal. That's right.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces about Justice Ginsburg, which I personally have always found fascinating, that we recognized her as a progressive liberal jurist.
Right.
And then there was Justice Scalia.
Yes.
Who was the opposite.
Complete opposite.
Complete opposite. Yet they had friendship.
Yeah. Oh, he was her closest friend on the court and vice versa. It's a fascinating story because he was as conservative as she was liberal, but they somehow became the closest of friends. They met in the 1970s when they both attended law school legal conferences, and she was very impressed by his brilliance and command of also legal decisions. And then they became close friends when he was appointed to the same federal court in 1992 that she was on, the DC Court of Appeals. And they and their family they used to celebrate New Year's Eve together every year. They used to go on vacations together. I have a picture in one of the photos of the 38 photos in my book is a picture of Justice Scalia they were in India, they and their spouses were in India, and Justice Scalia was sitting atop of one elephant, and Justice Ginsburg sitting atop the other, and they were waving and trying to shake hands with each other. But no, they had the utmost respect for her. In fact, it's interesting, when Justice Scalia died, the George Mason Law School, which is outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, and is known to be somewhat of a conservative law school. It named its law school, it renamed it after Justice Scalia. It renamed it the Scalia Law School. And liberals were aghast. They said, how can you do such a thing? In terms of balance, how can you name a law school after such a conservative jurist? And Ruth Bader Ginsburg publicly came out and defended it. He said he was a great legal scholar, one of the greatest of his generation, and you can only respect that and respect his memory.
It's remarkable. And the other piece of trivia between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia is this incredible love they had for opera. And
Yes.
There's a rumor that they actually were both in a real live opera in Washington, D.C.
They were. I should have mentioned that. And an opera by Richard Strauss. And they both wore their 18th century opera get-ups. And it's 1994. It was really a first. And that's one of the things that brought them together, was their love of opera. And I have a photograph of that in my book also, both of them in their opera costumes, as it were.
There's just so much. And I'm keeping an eye on the time because I know that we wanted to open this up to questions.
Certainly.
But, what I'd like to, before I open this up to questions, there's so many things we could say about Justice Ginsburg, but you've done such a deep dive into her life and her career. What do you think her legacy is?
Well, I think she will have a legacy as one of the great justices in American history. First of all, she served longer than any of the other Jewish justices. Both Justice Brandeis and Justice Frankfurter served for 23 years. Justice Ginsburg served for 27 years. And that's been one of the arguments. Some people have said that's why she didn't perhaps retire earlier, that she wanted to serve longer, the longest of any of the Jewish justices. But her legacy will be a great one because before she was on the court, but first of all, she was a very distinguished federal judge for 13 years and had very distinguished judicial opinions while on the federal bench. But also she was a great legal scholar in her own right before she was on the court. And her reputation, as I said before, had she never been on the court, she would have been well known already. And I think she was so eminently respected as a legal scholar and as a scholar at Columbia University Law School that added to her legacy. And as a civil libertarian, she was also very well known. She was a big advocate for civil rights and civil liberties. In addition, of course, for the rights of women and on the courts.
Yeah, she was outstanding. As I said, I'm still quite a groupie of.
Oh, sure. One more piece of trivia, if I may, and then
we can keep going.
You know, when she became a liberal icon, she said, "How could it be that someone my age, 82, I think at the time, is such a liberal icon?" The incredible RBG, and at one point, what's his name? Who's the late night talk show host? Stephen Colbert went to Washington to photograph Ruth Bader Ginsburg while she was doing her exercises and while she was working out. And she used to do 20 push-ups a day.
No.
And and she did that together with Elena Kagan. But Stephen Colbert went to Washington to interview her, and we happened to watch that on television that night, to interview her while she was doing her exercises. And it was a just tremendously impressive.
As long as there are no questions, I'm going to keep talking because there's so much to cover with her. One of the other things about Justice Ginsburg that she did that the other justices had not done is her dissents.
Yes, yes. The only one who did as many dissents as she did, actually a little more, was Justice Brandeis when he was on the court, the only other Jewish justice. But she dissented in a lot of cases, and a lot of her dissents later became the law of the land. She, and by dissenting, in other words, she wrote an opinion that diverged from the majority opinion. But because of that, and part of that was because she was part of the minority, the liberal minority on the court for many years. And, you know, it's interesting, for many years, there were 3 Jewish justices and 6 Catholic justices. Now there's 5 Catholic and 1 Protestant. And the Catholic justices were all more or less conservative, and the Jewish justices were liberal. And then Sonia Sotomayor was also joined the liberal bloc in some of the cases. But she would write, what is the Supreme Court decision about money in public life? About, I'm trying to think of the name of the decision now. What is it?
I'm not sure which.
There was a decision that corporations would have the same rights as individuals to, gosh, I was going to give an example of this, but I can't remember the case now, so my apologies. But she was very much against this decision, saying that corporations should have the same rights as people, as individuals, to contribute to election campaigns.
And the other thing, real quickly, is that she would oftentimes read her dissents to the court.
Yes, she would. Yes, very good point.
We have one question has come up, which is really fascinating. Jacob Mincer. Kim, should I read the question? I will. Okay, has there ever been a Muslim Supreme Court justice?
Has there a Muslim Supreme Court justice? No, there hasn't. And there have been and there was a Hindu federal judge who was considered for appointment a couple of times, but still hasn't been yet. But no, not a Muslim and not a Hindu. And what was I going to say? And whether or not there will be is a good question. But there have been different seats, though, that besides a Jewish seat and a Catholic seat, there's an African-American seat on the court now. When Thurgood Marshall died in 1990 or 1991, Clarence Thomas was appointed as his successor. But the disappointment was for liberals that Thurgood Marshall was a renowned liberal, and Clarence Thomas was still is one of the most conservative justices on the court. So it was an interesting opportunity to fill a seat with somebody of the same background, but not of the same political ideology.
Yes, it was definitely different. Let's see, David Popowski, I'm gonna say it out loud, is asking if you know Burden Walker, Nancy Alterman Walker's son, Elza Alterman's grandson, and Jack and Douglas's nephew. Burden was a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School and a former law clerk to Justice Ginsburg.
Oh gosh, no, I don't know, but she's had, you know, she had quite a few law clerks. You know, every justice has 2 or 3 depending, and she was on the court for 27 years. So no, I don't personally know.
It's a Carlton connection, which is what got everyone's attention. Thank you, David. And everyone is letting us know that the case that you were referring to is Citizens United v. Federal Election. Yes.
Citizens United, and that's the case that she's been, you talk about dissenting, she continued to dissent well after the case was argued and decided. And that was a case that she said years later, she wouldn't give up. She said that's the one case she would like to have overturned.
You know, I think that's also really one of the main points that distinguish Justice Ginsburg is oftentimes, you know, justices will dissent and just join in a dissension, but she really was creating a history so that people could use what she's written as law, going back to it. Yes,
very much so. Very true. And she was able to do that. And also she had longevity on the court. 27 years is a good, you know, I mean, there have been justices who have served much longer, but she had a nice, you know, despite her ill health, she was able to serve on the court many years where she was able to, her dissents, like as with Justice Brandeis, many of her dissents became the law of the land.
Right, fascinating. I go back and forth. So one of the other really fun pieces about Justice Ginsburg is we all know that as a judge, they wear this very plain black robe. Justice Ginsburg started wearing collars with her robes.
Right.
And there's rumors that each collar represented something different.
Yes, I've heard the same rumors. That I don't know. That I can't say, but it's interesting because she's diverged from the other justices. I must say one thing, by the way, which I didn't get a chance before, about her marriage with her husband, Martin. You know, they had a very egalitarian marriage. He did all the cooking in the family and throughout her judicial career. And, you know, when he left Harvard Law School to go to New York to start a law practice, she went with him. Then 15 years later, when she was appointed to the DC Court of Appeals, he followed her to Washington. And he gave up his partnership in a very prestigious New York law firm, plus his lectureship at Columbia Law School to follow her and to teach at Georgetown Law School. So they had apparently an idyllic marriage for 56 years. And whenever one of his law clerks, you mentioned law clerks before, had a birthday, Martin Ginsburg would bake either a cupcake or a birthday cake for the law clerk, which is kind of nice.
It's lovely. We're getting another question, which is, what do you think Justice Ginsburg would think about either enlarging the court or term limits?
I think she would be against enlarging the court. That's just my idea, my guess. I mean, it's not, I don't have anything to base this on, but she was, although she was so liberal, you know, in terms of her politics and her legal theory, she was traditional when it came to institutions, and the law and for the same reason, I don't think she would want to have term limits either, because people have recommended term limits. You know, there are term limits now for members of Congress, not for the Senate though, not for the Senate, and for governors in many states. But had there been term limits for her, she would have had to end her judicial career much sooner, which she didn't have to. So, and in terms of whether she would have been in favor of an expanded court, that I actually don't know, but my own sense is she wouldn't have.
You know, I agree with you. I think that she really respected and had enormous respect for the history of the court.
Precisely, exactly.
So yeah. I've really asked you, we've talked about a lot of things, and I know that you have more. Tell us maybe a little bit also about the Jewish justices that have come before Justice Ginsburg.
Well, she was the 8th Jewish justice. Justice Brandeis was the first. Then Justice Cardozo, Benjamin Cardozo, was the second. Justice Frankfurter, I mentioned, was the third. Then Arthur Goldberg, and then Abe Fortas. Now, they were all, what's interesting about several of them, many of them would, in all the, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer were both judges before they were Supreme Court justices. They were both federal judges. The other earlier justices came from very diverse backgrounds. Benjamin Cardozo was the chief judge of the New York State Supreme Court. Felix Frankfurter was a professor at Harvard Law School. He was the first Jewish professor at Harvard Law School, where he taught for 25 years. And he also was an advisor to FDR. Now, what's interesting is when you're on the Supreme Court, you're not supposed to advise presidents. You're supposed to stay out of politics, at least partisan politics. Now, actually, Justice Brandeis didn't hold by that completely. He advised FDR and also Woodrow Wilson, and so did Felix Frankfurter. But I forgot to mention, when I mentioned Abe Fortas before, another problem that Abe Fortas had, why he had to resign from the court in somewhat a bit of controversy, was that he continued to be a close advisor of Lyndon Johnson of LBJ while he was on the Supreme Court. People said he spent more time in the Oval Office than he did in the Supreme Court chambers. In fact, he wrote LBJ's State of the Union speech in 1966. And that's a no-no for justices. And that's something that Felix Frankfurter was criticized for before, back in the 1930s. And Frankfurter was appointed then by FDR to the Supreme Court in 1939.
It's fascinating to hear you say that, because, you know, so many of us believe that the Supreme Court is very separate and apart. It does not get involved in politics.
Right.
It's been tested, you know, the last few years, and now you're telling us there's actually precedent for that.
Oh, there's a lot of precedent. Yeah. There's a lot of precedent. And even somebody like Justice Brandeis, who was greatly admired, especially by liberals, he was criticized a bit for not staying aloof from politics. In fact, he had Felix Frankfurter helped him with this. He had Felix Frankfurter write law review and other articles under his name that were really written by Justice Brandeis while Brandeis was on the court. And he would publish them under his name. And that was also kind of a no-no that you don't do, which, and that only became known much later on.
That's amazing. So tell me, what have I not asked you yet?
Well, the only thing we haven't talked about, and it might be just for a moment, is the Jewishness of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because she was very Jewishly identified. She was the only justice who had a mezuzah, on her Supreme Court door, which was affixed by the Chabad rabbi in Washington, D.C. She had a plaque in her office that said, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, which is Hebrew for justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And she always talked about, she wasn't a religiously observant, she belonged to a synagogue, nominally, to the big conservative synagogue in Washington, D.C., But they say that for many years she was aloof from religious observance because she was so adversely affected by the tragic death of her mother when the day before her graduation from high school, that her religious observance parted the way a bit. But she believed in Jewish values and believed in Jewish ethical values and social values, and that they were the basis of her Supreme Court decisions, of many of them.
It's fascinating. I agree with you. I think to this day we can see those Jewish values reflected in many of her opinions, and also, how it moved her forward for equal opportunity for both men and women.
Precisely.
Yes, it was great.
Yeah. And I would say I've always been like you, a great admirer of her. And I would say she's been not only one of the great justices generally on the Supreme Court, but one of the two greatest Jewish justices, together with Justice Brandeis, who also deserves to be included there. But she was a great person.
She made us proud. I'm not going to monopolize your time. I know that Shirley Berman also wanted to speak with you. So I'm going to now let Shirley take over. But I just want to thank you, Dr. Dalin. This has just been such a joy, a pleasure, and fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Ellen. I thank you, and I feel the same way. It's been wonderful.
All right.
It's been so good to meet you, too.
Nice to see you.
Virtually.
Shirley?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Kim, Yalan, Ellen, and my dear friend, David Dalin, Dr. David Dalin. I had the pleasure of attending a presentation given by Dr. Dalin in Pennsylvania over a year and a half ago. David presented to a full house his wonderful book entitled Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, which you've got. Yes, thank you. I have it here on the side as well. And that's why I'm doing this. I want to promote his book. A host of legal minds were in attendance, along with a good portion of northeastern Pennsylvania Jewish community, and he received a standing ovation. It was really quite a wonderful evening. I whipped out my business card thinking that I'm going to get through this crowd and convince Dr. Dalin to come to Charleston. As I approached David with a short, prepared proposal, I noticed that he had a cast on his leg. I thought, he won't be able to get away from me. Do you remember that cast, David?
Yes.
Finally, it was my turn to speak with him. I gave him my card and said, although I'm in Pennsylvania, I represent the Scholar in Resident program at Synagogue Emmanuel in Charleston. David's eyes just lit up and he said, Charleston? South Carolina? Yes, I said. David replied, oh, I would love to come to Charleston. Needless to say, I was just left with a smile on my face. Dr. Dalin's book examines the lives, legal careers, and the legacy of the 8 Jewish justices of the Supreme Court. I am not going to go through the list because we've done that already. David describes how the Supreme Court justices are chosen and also the dynamics of the court. One review that I looked at stated, this book is well written, thoroughly researched and a great read. It is not only about the Jewish justices of the Supreme Court. Anyone interested in American history, history of anti-Semitism in the United States, and the development of our legal system will find this book fascinating and even entertaining. One of the things that I loved were the quirky details that David weaves in through the book. One of them that you discussed was the mezuzah on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's doorpost. And also, Elena Kagan was a bat mitzvah. And these are just wonderful details that enrich the whole tenor. There was a time when no president would nominate anyone that wasn't male or Protestant. So we've come a long way. With great optimism, Synagogue Emmanuel will welcome next year in person, Alavai, it should only be, Dr. Dalin for a stimulating weekend, which will be open to the entire community. Watch for the details, and thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Shirley, for your kind words. This is wonderful.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.